Directed by Chuck Russell and starring Jamie Campbell Bower, who you may know as Vecna from the Stranger Things series, we are talking Witchboard from 2024. And this is actually a remake of a 1986 movie of the same name, although it does take a few new twists. So, what is the story of Witchboard 2024? It follows a group of kind of restaurant entrepreneurs as they are preparing to open a kind of boutique new restaurant in New Orleans. And one of this group of people finds this witchboard just out in the woods and decides to kind of bring it home and maybe think about using it as a kind of bit of decoration in the this new restaurant. But little do they know, this witchboard has a sordid history. It is a genuine witchboard, hundreds of years old, that was used in the practice of witchcraft and has been associated with a powerful witch and has been recently stolen from a museum and has ended up in these kind of woods. Of course, they start messing around with it, and this causes the forces of evil to rear their head and cause problems for our group of restaurant entrepreneurs. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So I think the original Witchboard, the 1986 movie, is one of these films which is probably due for a remake. It's not a film, I think, that had a particularly big following in the 80s. It's kind of one of those ones that kind of went under the radar a little bit, although they did spawn a few sequels. They obviously did have its fans, but certainly not one of the more well-known kind of movies to get a remake for sure. What does this one offer? Now, this obviously being a a 2024 reasonably budgeted movie, and Chuck Russell is an experienced horror director here. It gives it a certain sort of professional sheen, and this one looks like it has a decent production value. It very much feels like a kind of studio style of horror movie. If you've seen those type of cinema release sort of horror movies compared to the more indie ones, it has that sort of that production feel to it, but also it does have the downsides of that, where it ultimately is somewhat predictable, I guess you would say. But what works is it does have this this kind of higher budget sheen to it, and it does have a professional production values. I actually think it's quite well directed and everything like that. I do think it has these nice little touches in the movie. Now, as the film starts and we start to have our kind of group of protagonists mess around with this witchboard, we start to see more subtle kind of things happening, kind of ghostly sort of reflections in kitchen equipment and things like this. And we have our first sort of death, which I think is was quite well handled. The way it works, it almost gets written off as a sort of an accident and stuff like that. But it's one of these kind of set pieces which I think was quite strong. So I actually kind of quite enjoyed this kind of initial sort of set up to this kind of movie. This handled pretty well. I think the effects, I have seen some critiques of the effects, but I have to say I didn't think the effects were a problem at all. I actually thought they were pretty well done. I mean, yeah, some of them are sort of CGI, but it's fine. It looks pretty good if you ask me. That was all fairly good. We have obviously Jamie Campbell Bower. He turns up around halfway through, and he's kind of like an expert on the occult, you might say. And he has a kind of an interesting kind of character, because you're not quite sure what his motivations are. And there's some really kind of interesting things done, I think, with just the sort of the hair and makeup and that sort of thing. Like, he's got these 3 triplets, these kind of blonde women that sort of follow him around. They're kind of white witches, but they kind of look visually quite interesting because they all look somewhat identical and stuff like that. And so there's some interesting things done here that are sort of stylistic choices that I kind of quite enjoyed. So again, the production design really does shine through. Story-wise, there's a really interesting twist which happens just after the kind of the halfway mark. that involves our female protagonist and this kind of witch, which is kind of our female antagonist, if you like. I won't say what it is, because I think it's obviously quite... to me, it was the most interesting thing in the movie in regards to the story-wise. But I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. And like, you know, how are we going to kind of get out of this kind of situation, so to speak? So that I could have quite enjoyed. As the movie goes on, and this is going to be a negative as well, the movie does kind of ratchet up the stakes, and I think it gets to there's somewhat some over-the-top sequences in this movie. We have this kind of restaurant scene and this big opening night, for example, and things take a supernatural turn. You know, you could arguably say, on a positive column at least, I think the stakes get bigger as the film goes on, and certainly it builds to a crescendo. I do think it gets a little bit over the top at times, but you know, arguably you could say yes, the movie certainly builds on what was initially somewhat subtle into kind of more overt as the film goes on. So if you like this gradually building escalation of kind of supernatural shenanigans, then you'll definitely like this. I have to say, I thought the acting was all pretty good. I do think some of the characters are written quite poorly, which we'll come on to. But I don't think it's a problem with the acting. I think the acting here is all pretty fine. Everyone does an enough job. You know, some of the characters are a little sort of, again, they're written to be somewhat sort of cliches, to be honest. But acting all fine wise. So overall, on the positives, you know, it was a fun, enjoyable movie. In many respects, I enjoyed the ride. It's kind of like a little bit like a thrill ride, this one. What doesn't work, now I do have to say, talking about the characters, I think some of the motivations of these characters are really skew-with. I didn't really feel like a lot of the motivations really made sense. We do have flashbacks to a kind of, I think it's like the 17th century, and both in modern times and in the kind of these past flashbacks, there were sequences where I felt characters' motivations, I just didn't really understand why they were doing certain things, why they were aligning with certain people, why they were trying to align with certain people, why they were things like this, and just then decisions that were made. And again, I don't want to spoil it for you, so I don't want to point out particular plot points, but to me it just didn't make sense why people were doing certain things. What was their motivation? And the other thing, this movie, I mean, it talks a lot about fate and how things are always destined to be this way. And the movie can tell us, oh, this was fate, this was kind of all destined. To me, it seems more like convenience. Again, I'm not going to spoil stuff for you, but there's things here thinking, come on. This is very, very convenient. But it's written off as, oh, it's fate. And I'm like, yeah, right. So there's that. Our central female protagonist, this character called Emily, I have to say, she comes across as very unsympathetic. I didn't really feel like we got to know her, but she's our main female protagonist. And what we do see on screen, I have to say, she felt somewhat selfish. And, you know, you struggle to feel a lot of sympathy with her, I have to say. I think the male protagonist fares better, but our female protagonist, she just seems quite self-centered. And I didn't really feel this connection between her and our male protagonist, who are a couple. And I really failed to see what the attraction was for him. I mean, she's an attractive woman, I don't mean that. But like, as a sort of person, why were they together? Because it didn't really feel like they got on particularly well, to a degree. And she just seems quite selfish. Now, you could arguably say, at a point in the movie, that she is starting to be influenced by this witchboard. And that's fair to say. But I would say even before that, and even at the beginning of this kind of like, was when the witchboard turns up, you feel like the kind of influence is relatively minor at that point. So yeah, I didn't really feel like our main female protagonist was a particularly likeable kind of character. So, as I've kind of hinted to, as the film goes on and we kind of get into our third act, it gets a little bit over the top. To the point where I have to say, I thought it was a little bit silly. Considering how kind of subtle the movie was initially, and at least in the kind of when we first start to see supernatural stuff for our main protagonists, the kind of like the craziness that happens. And again, I'm going to tie this into, I didn't quite understand the motivations. You know, we even like from our witch, you know, she has this thing about revenge. Well, who are you trying to get revenge on exactly? It doesn't make any sense. I guess it's just supernatural intentions. Who knows? Maybe they're all over the place. But to me, I was thinking, what? And even at the very end of the movie, the very last sequence of the movie, I was thinking, I just don't buy the kind of the motivations here. So I found this movie's writing to be the main problem for me. If you can kind of somewhat kind of put that to the side, I do think this movie has entertainment value. I think it's a rich visual spectacle. I think there's some decent sort of set pieces, albeit I think sometimes it could have reined itself in a little bit. And you can kind of just enjoy it for a kind of a fun, admittedly somewhat sort of throwaway movie. It's maybe not the most intelligent of movies, but I do think it's a kind of a fun watch at least. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.